For most of American history, poetry occupied a place in public life that is difficult to imagine today. School children memorized it, newspapers published it, politicians quoted it. Ordinary Americans bought books of verse and numbers that would astonish modern publishers. And for much of the 20th century, the United States Post Office considered poets important enough to place on the nation's postage stamps, alongside presidents, generals, inventors, and statesmen. I'm Mark Schauer, and this is Dispatches from the Lost Republic. The earliest poet on U.S. postage appeared as a president, Abraham Lincoln. Long before the United States began honoring poets on postage, it placed a poet in the White House. Lincoln's surviving verse reveals a writer preoccupied with memory, mortality, and fate. Those instincts found their highest expression not in verse, but in prose. The Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural Address remain among the most powerful works in American literature. And Lincoln devoted himself to poetry with the same intensity he devoted himself to politics. He might have become one of the major American poets of the 19th century. 3 decades later, the Post Office created what remains the foundational poetic issue in U.S. philately, part of the famous American series of 1940. The 1-cent denomination honored Henry Longfellow, America's first internationally famous poet. Today, he's remembered primarily for Paul Revere's Ride, but his life contained tragedy as well as triumph. After his wife died in a household fire, he wore the beard that became his trademark, partly to conceal burns suffered while trying to save her. The 2-cent stamp honored John Greenleaf Whittier, abolitionist, Quaker, author of Snowbound. During his lifetime, he was among the most widely read Americans. The 3-cent denomination featured James Russell Lowell, poet, critic, editor, diplomat, one of the architects of American literary culture. On the 5-cent denomination, Walt Whitman fundamentally transformed American poetry. His 1855 collection, Leaves of Grass, abandoned conventional meter and rhyme in favor of free verse, creating a distinctly American literary voice. No 19th century American poet exerted a greater influence on modern poetry. On the 10-cent stamp was James Whitcomb Riley, the Hoosier poet, whose sentimental dialect verse made him one of the best-selling authors in America during the 1890s, rivaling Mark Twain in notoriety. Taken together, these 5 stamps represented the literary canon as Americans understood it in 1940. But the poetic canon did not stand still. One of the earliest editions came in 1949 with Edgar Allan Poe, Scott number 986. Poe remains perhaps the most internationally recognized American poet. Though equally famous for short stories and literary criticism, poems like The Raven and Annabel Lee helped establish a distinctly American Gothic poetic tradition. The following decades brought recognition to poets who would have surprised earlier generations. Emily Dickinson, honored on Scott 1436 in 1971, published only a handful of poems during her lifetime. Today, she's widely regarded as one of the greatest poets in the English language. Her compressed language, unconventional punctuation, and psychological insight transformed American poetry. A year later, Sidney Lanier was on Scott 1446. Born in Georgia, he served nearly 4 years in Confederate uniform and contracted the tuberculosis that would eventually kill him. Just as works such as The Marshes of Glynn were establishing him as one of the South's major literary voices, he died at age 39. Illinois contributed Edgar Lee Masters, honored on Scott 1405. who achieved immortality through a single masterpiece, Spoon River Anthology. Through the voices of dead residents speaking from their graves, Masters exposed the secrets, disappointments, ambitions, and hypocrisies of small-town America. And then there's Robinson Jeffers, Scott 1484, the reason we're standing here. Jeffers belonged to California and Big Sur in a way few major American writers have belonged to any place. While many poets turned inward toward psychology or toward politics, Jeffers looked toward cliffs, oceans, hawks, storms, geological time. He argued that humanity exaggerated its own importance, that the sandstone beneath our feet would outlast governments, ideologies, entire empires. Robert Frost on Scott 1526 in 1974 represented a very different version of America. More than any 20th century poet, Frost became identified with rural New England. Stone walls, snowy woods, farms, country roads populate his verse. Yet beneath those familiar images lay darker themes: isolation, morality, the limits of human understanding. A 4-time Pulitzer Prize winner, Frost achieved a level of recognition unmatched by any American poet of his era. His appearance at John F. Kennedy's inauguration in 1961 symbolically linked poetry and public life at the highest level. Today, many of these writers survive more readily in albums than in conversation. Yet the stamps remain. I'm Mark Schauer, and this is Dispatches from the Lost Republic.